Welcome. We are about to start lecture number 34. And last time we completed chapter 47. So we're about to start with chapter 48. And chapter 47 and the previous chapters before that discussed the issue of how senses, the five senses that we as human beings have, are sometimes ascribed to God. And Rambam mentioned that the three higher senses, the ones that you can perceive things from a distance, sight and hearing and smelling, right, are all things that are attributed to God. But the lower senses, the one that are more base, that require actual physical contact, are never attributed to God, and those referring to touch and taste. So on the subject of senses, the Rambam is going to go off on a little bit about this next chapter about the specific sense of hearing. And then he's going to discuss a little bit about angels, which I kind of gave away in my earlier text this morning. And remember, as usual, feel free to stop me, raise your hand if you have any comments. When I read chapter 48, I'm going to do a little bit more from the Hebrew than the English. But try to follow in the Pines. In the Pines, it's page 106, chapter 48. So if you recall, in the past, we had a Rambam loves the Onkelos, Targum Onkelos, the Aramaic translation that was written by Onkelos, who was a Greek or Roman convert to somewhere in the 2nd century. Who wrote the Targum, the Aramaic translation of the Torah. And Rambam emphasized how Onkelos was very, very careful to translate any anthropomorphic phrases with reference to God in a way that removed the anthropomorphism. And Rambam gave us examples of this a while back. We discussed that. So now he's going to go on a little bit more. So he says, whenever it says the idea of listening, of hishama, to listen or to hear, right? Whenever it's in biachas lashem, in regard to God, Yisrael may be exalted, you find that Onkelos the convert, or Onkelos the proselyte, was very careful and explain that it's referring to not the God actually hearing, because we said God doesn't have senses, he doesn't hear things, but it's referring to God apprehending something, okay, which means the intellectual, the God somehow apprehends it, and we just refer to it as hearing because that's the way we hear things, that's the way we process things. However, and therefore, if he says like it recurs to the regard of a prayer, if someone prays to God, right, and it says it was heard before the Lord, right? So he says, and he translates it, I will surely accept, right? In other words, doesn't mean that he will hear it, but God will listen and then decide to accept the prayer. The example here is from Shemos, where it says, do not mistreat a widow or an orphan. This is chapter 22, verse 22. So the verse says in Hebrew, it says, Im aneta ane oso, if you mistreat him, ki im tza'ok, for then if he cries out to me, shamoa eshma tza'akaso, I will hear his cry. And Onkelos translates that im ano ta'ane yosei, if you cause him suffering, are im mikbal yikbel, if he will start to pray to me, kadamai, before me, kabbalah ekabel. So that are familiar with the term, Kabbalah means to accept, kivilte, I will accept his prayer. So again, we see that doesn't mean that God will hear the prayer, right? Because there's no such thing as hearing by God, but it means he will accept the prayer. However, so that's hearing, but what about sight? So sight is another common thing. And how does Onkelos translate sight in a way that will support Rambam's assertion that every time it uses the word sight, it doesn't actually mean that God sees, but rather it means that God perceives, right? And we just where the Torah just, so how does Onkelos translate? Because Rambam keeps on bringing support from Onkelos. How does that work? So the problem with that is Rambam comes up against the problem. His proof is not going to work so well. So we'll see how Rambam deals with what happens when he comes up against against a little bump in his logic, in his claim. But before I say that, I want to mention what Rabbi Kapach in his Hebrew translation and commentary mentions, that in the time of Rambam, the practice of children when they learned Tanakh was to learn the Hebrew and the Aramaic together. So Rambam would have learned from childhood. He would have learned the verses plus the Aramaic translation by Onkelos. So it would be deeply ingrained. I still remember I learned in a cheder. I remember translating the verses of the Torah into Yiddish, and when I learned Bereshis, at least I still see it in Yiddish. So the Rambam would have learned it and still see the translations in Aramaic. So it's very deeply ingrained, and we'll see if you understand that, you can understand why Rambam goes into this in such depth, and it's so important to him to make sure that Onkelos truly proves his point the way he claims that it does. So
they
now,
still do that in most Yemenite synagogues on Shabbat.
Yeah, he actually, interesting enough, Kapach points that out, that the Yemenites still do have the same practice. Thank you for bringing that up, though. He says that was the practice then everywhere. But yes, absolutely. Thank you. So so the problem is that Onkelos has two different versions, that when he translates the word and God sees, he translates it in two separate ways, right? And Rambam says, and the purpose and intention of which are not clear to me, why he does this like this. In some places, he interprets the word, right, Vayar Hashem, and the Lord saw by the words, and the Lord beheld, meaning V'chaza Hashem. The Aramaic word V'chaza, lachazot in Aramaic, right, refers to see, it's sight, right? Something that he actually beholds, he actually sees. Whereas in other passages, he interprets them as follows: V'gali kadam Adonai, and it was revealed before God. So the fact that, so the question right away, the immediate question is, B'chaza, that sounds like seeing. Onkelos, according to Rambam, should never translate God as seeing. He should always translate the word ra'ah as perceiving, as something being revealed to him, right? Why sometimes does he use the word chaza? So right away he says, the fact that he uses I really apologize for bouncing back and forth from Hebrew to English, but I can't help it. That he translates the chaza Hashem muchach, it's clear that the word chaza in the Lashon Arami Mishuta, in his version of Aramaic, right? So remember that the Aramaic that Onkelos would have spoken wouldn't necessarily be the same exact as Talmudic Aramaic, or wouldn't necessarily be the same exact as the Aramaic that from later generations. So therefore, clearly, if he's using the word chaza, right? The first question, how could he use chaza? Well, must be it's a language that's mishutaf, right? Which we are saying it's equivocal. In other words, just like the Hebrew word ra'ah, we already translated, doesn't really always mean to see, but it can also mean to apprehend. The same thing, the word chaza in Aramaic means that. However, so that answers part of the question, but there's still more. Right? It could, just like it refers, in other words, it refers to apprehending within the intellect just as much as it refers to apprehension of the senses, which would be an actual sight. This being so, would that I knew why in some cases he avoids the expression and interprets the Hebrew words as, and it was revealed before the Lord. So if chaza is acceptable, it's acceptable because I just explained what chaza, to see, to behold means, right? So then why sometimes does he actually do what I would have expected him to do and say Vigali, and it was revealed before God? So remember, it's careful when you see in the English revealed, in the Hebrew it reads Vigali, right? Not in the Hebrew, I mean in the Aramaic of the Onkelos himself, it's Vigali. And if it says, if in the English in the Pines he says beheld, that's the Pines translation of the Hebrew of the Aramaic word vichaza, which would be the direct translation of the Hebrew word ra'ah. So just keep that in mind. I'm sorry if it's a little confusing, but as we keep making the point, it'll get more and more clear. So the Rambam says, if chaza is acceptable, right, then because chaza could mean to see or to apprehend, then why not just stick with chaza all the time? Why does he sometimes say the word that chaza, and why does he sometimes use the word gali, which is even more of a secondary term? So Rambam starts thinking like this. So when I examined the copies of this translation that I could find, and with all what I had heard in the course of instruction, and Kapach references based especially on his Arabic translation, Bisman Halimud is Kapach, and Kapach makes a note here that based on his Arab understanding of the original Judeo-Arabic, Rambam was talking about the course of instruction from his childhood. In other words, when I learned it when I was young, is what the Rambam was saying, based on what I remember from the old days. Remember, the Moreh Nevuchim is one of the latest books he wrote in his life. So he's basically saying, I remember as a kid from Onkelos reading it all, right? And from what I remembered, and from when I went back to Onkelos and learned through it, I discovered that in the cases in which the word seeing, so he's going to find a little path. When the word seeing is found in conjunction, when the Torah uses the word ra'ah in conjunction with wrongdoing or harming or committing an act of aggression. In other words, think of this, if the Torah describes something that happens, and then it says God saw it, right? So there's seeing the action, but then if the action, an action that we see could be good or could be evil based on the circumstances. But when God sees an action, and then the Torah refers to God seeing it as evil or as bad or as suffering, that implies an interpretation, right? Right? I see somebody punching someone in the face, I might right away think it's bad. But then I might find out that he's punching him in the face because he was threatening him, or he was punching him in the face. There might have been some justification for it. Once you learn the circumstances, right? Maybe he was being attacked, so he punched him. Who knows? But God sees. So when it's in, so Rambam is explaining when Onkelos sees a place where God has to see, meaning it was seen to him as something bad, then it uses vigali. It was revealed before the Lord. Thus, there is no doubt that the word to behold, meaning chaza, has in that language the meaning to apprehend and to establish the thing apprehended as it is apprehended. In other words, to see it and to understand what you saw as actually being what you saw. Therefore, when seeing is connected in connection with wrongdoing, he did not say and he beheld, but rather and it was revealed. So when there's an interpretation involved, then Onkelos uses the next language and says, and vigali kadam Hashem. For I found that he used the word to behold, v'chaza, to interpret in the term seeing in all the passage in all the Torah, right? When the word is used in reference to God. So in other words, everywhere, almost everywhere, Onkelos translates ra'ah to chaza, which is a much more exact translation. However, whenever I'm going to give you a long list, I'm about to give you a long list of places where he translates vigali, and all of these places are places which are God has to discern that it's evil. So then he starts giving examples. So ki ra'ah Hashem et anyi, right? It says, by Yaakov Avinu, by Jacob, it says, because God has seen my suffering. So Onkelos translates that arei gali kadam Hashem ulvani, because it's been revealed before God, right? So here God has to see what Jacob is going through and then interpret that it's suffering. Kira isi es kol asher lavan osel lach, right? This is actually an angel of God, Rambam is going to point out, but it's still a reference to seeing, right? Everything that Lavan is doing to you, and it's repeated as arei gali kodamai. It is revealed before me, and even though it's referring to an angel there, it's still it's not so much seeing that Jacob was acting as a shepherd, but seeing that while he was acting that way, the way Lavan was treating him was improper, was inappropriate. Kivan shu aval, because he was making him suffer. It was something that was actually wrong. Right? Or Vayar Lakim es bnei Israel. God saw the people of Israel. This is talking about when they were slaves in Egypt. Vigali kadam Hashem shibuda devnei Israel. And it was revealed before God the suffering and then enslavement of the people of Israel. Or Ra'o ra'isi es ani ami. I have seen the suffering of my nation. Again, or V'gam ra'isi es alachatz. Again, v'af gali kadamai. So again, the same term gali. And Rambam goes over and over and over. Gali or Ra'isi Asamas, I've seen this nation, meaning Gali Kadamai Amahadain. I see that they are rebellious. I see that what they are doing is rebellious towards me. So he goes on and on and on. These examples, if you go all the way down to the end of the paragraph, the long paragraph on page 107. Thus, it is on this account that Onkelos translates every reference to enslavement or disobedience, or before he mentioned suffering, affliction, etc., as revealed, as gali. So that's all good. So now Rambam just laid down a rule, right? The rule is when this discernment of suffering, it says vigali, that it was revealed before God. When it was just simply referring to God seeing something or apprehending something, it uses the word chaza, see. However, there's exceptions to this rule. And that's going to kind of put a bump in the road over here. Remember, this is so important to Rambam because he quoted Onkelos before as like the solid support for his entire idea that all of these anthropomorphic references were not meant to be interpreted that way, and Onkelos was the big proof. So making sure that Onkelos kind of fits with this idea is very important to Rambam, and especially when we understand that that's how everyone studied in those days. Everyone studied with Onkelos Aramaic translation. It's kind of like, it's just that's the way people studied it. That's the way they knew it, and it has to fit. So, but here's a bump though. Ella, however, this excellent and lengthy explanation, in other words, he's giving himself a pat on the back, after searching the entire Torah and giving you all these examples and laying down this solid rule, right? Which is not subject to doubt. I'm sure I'm right about this. I have to be right about this, right? But it's spoiled for me by 3 passages that, if the analogy held good, ought to have been interpreted by him as follows. In other words, there's 3 exceptions that don't fit. So my rule is just not working all the way through. And what are these 3 places? For example, hold on one second. Vayar Hashem ki rabba ro'at ha'adam, right? This is the these are the following places. And it was, wait a second. I'm seeing a little difference between the Hebrew. Okay, I'm turning to page 108. The Lord beheld him. I'm sorry, I kind of ran ahead in the Hebrew and I got lost in the English part. So the passage are as follows. And the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great. That's famous from Parshas Noach, from the story of Noah, right? And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. Again, from the same story. And then later, and the Lord saw that Leah was hated. The explanation over on these 3 places, right, he translates it not as gali, but as chaza. He translated as to see. And according to my rule, these are clearly instances where it should have used the language gali. So Rambam resorts to a common answer. So the explanation that seems to me most probable is just a mistake, because he says we don't have Onkelos's autograph on these passages. So somebody was copying, saw the word ra'ah, translated in chaza, and then it just fell a mistake in the manuscript. You show me a signed manuscript with signed Onkelos Hager, and then I'll tell you if it's legit. But whatever, the printer blew it off, finished. That's one understanding. So that's how Rambam insists that his rule, the explanation, his solid explanation, which must be correct, it must be that it was just a mistake in the version. As for his and then there's another place which you might think is an exception, is a famous place where it says Elo Kim Yir Elo Haseh B'ni, right? Where this is by the Akedat Yitzchak, by the binding of Isaac, where it says God will show him the Seh B'ni. God will show him the sheep, my son. So, and it's translated as Kadam Hashem Gali Imra. Before God, it is revealed. And according to Rambam's rule, it should have said Chaza. There's no interpretation as to whether a sheep is a sheep, right? If you're saying God sees the sheep, right? It's what interpretation is involved, right? So again, this is another exception to the rule the other way around. But this one, Rambam isn't going to resort to saying that the manuscripts are off, but he'll say that it must be because if we have to understand the language and the Aramaic dialect that Onkelos spoke, And it's possible that the word chaza would have given the impression that that God was apprehending, right? Because remember, Rambam said that chaza means not just to see, but it means to apprehend, that God is somehow apprehending a sheep, which is somehow a lowly thing. So he chose not to say to turn the term chaza. So as far as these passages are concerned, a careful investigation should be made with the view correcting the copies of the translation. So Rambam is basically writing a letter to the publisher. Somebody's got to figure this out and make the proper corrections, because it must be a mistake. If, however, it turns out that my assumption that it's a mistake is wrong, right? The passages are found. We do find the old copy, the original from the 2nd century with Onkelos' signature. I am Onkelos Hager with the stamp, right? Then I do not know what purpose Onkelos had in translating this matter. Then I can't explain it, and I don't know, and you'll just have to figure it out on your own. I like this because it kind of makes Rambam very human when he writes things like this. So it kind of makes it a little bit more enjoyable. So that is the end of Rambam's discussion of hearing, seeing, senses as reference to God, why certain terms are used. And the one thing that we come out with is that the Torah uses these terms, right, because they're human terms that people can understand, but the purpose is to take us above that level, to say, what does it mean that God sees if he can't see? It means he apprehends. So it means that God is an intellect. I mean, he's something that apprehends, something that sees and knows and understands, but in ways that we can't describe it in human words. So we use human words because we have no other choice. All right, now we're going to go to chapter 49. Before I do that, let me open the floor for questions or comments about what we just read.
Just what you just said about can't, that itself would be demeaning to God. So that's why there has to be some way of us saying that God does something, because to say that he can't see, it's
right.
He's almost less than human. So that's
right. It makes it sound like there's something we can do that he can't. Right. But Rambam would say it's not that he can't. It's that it's an irrelevant discussion about God. You know, like sight is a lowly thing that we require to perceive things, but it's not something that's lacking. It's something it's just completely irrelevant. But yeah, you're right. I hear what you're saying. Any other comments about what we just studied, or comments about the whole issue of the senses and stuff like that? If there aren't, we'll go on.
Do we know who?
So I'm gonna say, before I start chapter 49, I want to point out that Rambam is going to drop a bomb which is going to give us a hint as to how he understands the concept of angels, and then he's going to come back to it at more length later. And in a sense, he's teasing us, but in a sense, he's laying out the groundwork so that as we get deeper and deeper and deeper into the book, we'll get more and more and more familiar with how he understands things. Now, remember, in Aristotelian philosophy, and Rambam understands it philosophically this way as well, God is the prime mover, right? In other words, everything in the world has something that makes it go, right? And whatever makes it go, something makes that go. And whatever makes that go, something makes that go. And the way they understood it then was, they understood that the movement of the moon and the stars and so on cause actions on this world, and which cause more actions, which cause more things to happen. And eventually it ends up in people doing certain things, etc. But ultimately, because everything that moves needs something that makes it move, there has to be a prime mover. There has to be something that makes it all move. And what is it that makes it all go? I just summarized the proof of God of Aristotle, which is also basically the same proof of God's existence that Rambam uses. There's a prime mover. Somebody's making it all go. And who's that? God. He makes it go through all of these other things that we see that are creations of his. But everything other than God himself is a creation. Now, this is really crucial, because when you call something a creation in Rambam's philosophy, in Rambam's mind, that means that it's mundane. That means that it's physical. Even if you can't see it, even if you can't necessarily describe it with your senses, it's a physical created being, just like you or I are created beings, right? A rock is a created being, earth is a created being, the moon and the spheres of the heavens are created beings, and angels are created beings. So angels are created just like we are. Now, the way Rambam sees things is very, very similar. And I'm going on a little jump here, but I'm going to take this leap anyway, because in a modern scientific mind, we think of things so differently. And I want to compare and say that when we think of forces of nature, we think about gravitation, electromagnetic forces, the various forces that are out there that we can't really see and we can't really describe. We can quantify them with formulas, but we don't. That's very, very similar, if not identical, to what the Rambam means when he calls things an intellect. It means it's a force. It's something that makes things happen. It's something that through which the force that are emanated from God originally and eventually makes its way to us, right? Those are the forces by which the world works. It's similar to how Rambam understands, demons and devils and things like that as being the things that cause suffering, like illnesses, the forces of nature that cause things to go wrong, the things to go bad. There are forces which you couldn't define. Nowadays, some of those things we can define as microbes or, bacteria or viruses. But the things that can't be seen or described, those are those forces. If you think of it this way, I think it'll give us a really good handle on understanding how Rambam is going to explain the idea of an angel. But the crucial point, well, there's a lot of crucial points, but probably the crucial point with the capital T is that they are also creations. They are also creations of God, right? They are created beings just like we are. So here we go. The angels, too, are not endowed with bodies, but they are intellects separate from matter. In other words, matter we can see and define. We can say it's green, it's yellow, it's soft, it's hard, it's rough, it's smooth, right? But angels are not endowed with bodies. However, they are the objects of an act, meaning they are the objects that something happened to create them. And God has created them, as will be explained. Now, I will get into this in more depth later, right? But it's important for me to lay down this idea now. God created them. The sages say in Bereshit Rabbah, right? We say in Bereshit Rabbah, the flaming sword. This is Lav Acherev HaMitapechet. This is the guardians at the gates of the Garden of Eden, right? They have the flaming swords that are flipping around, right? So what does this mean? It alludes to the fact that they flip around. They sometimes turn into men, sometimes women, sometimes spirits, sometimes angels. Now, one might read this and say, oh, angels can take all different forms. And you might think of angels taking forms of men, of women, of trees and birds. And that's not what Rambam understands it completely differently, in a very rationalistic way. Through this dictum, they have made it clear that the angels are not endowed with matter, and outside the mind, they have no fixed corporeal shape. There is nothing corporeal to them. There is no matter that makes up the angel, but that all such shapes are to be perceived in a vision of prophecy. Because they have no matter or form, therefore, when a prophet perceives them, when a prophet describes them, he or she describes them as having appeared with forms. That's why, in consequence of the action of the imaginative capacity, because of what the person is thinking, when the person perceives the angel, his mind creates this image that imagines the angel appearing in a certain way based on whatever it is, the message that the angel is trying to convey to that person, to that prophet, as will be mentioned in connection with the notion of the true reality of prophecy. When we get to understand prophecy, we will understand that prophecy is really the human mind developing pictures with which to understand the messages that are coming to him from higher intellects. Okay. So as for their dictum, sometimes into women, what does it mean that they sometimes turn into women? It implies the prophets likewise sometimes see angels in the vision of prophecy for women, like the famous vision of Zechariah, and behold, there came forth two women, and the wind was in their wings. That's one of the origins of the idea that's so popular today. We think of an angel, we think of a woman with white wings and everything. The angel comes, that's from Zechariah's prophecy. So that's why they kept flipping this around. So now you already know it's very difficult for man to apprehend, except after strenuous training, that which is pure of matter and absolutely devoid of corporeality. It's very hard for us to conceive of this idea of something that exists, that's real, that's actual, right? But doesn't have any matter. Right, which is why, think about it for a moment, it took so long for people to get the idea of light not being photons, right? In the old days, they used to think light is must be a matter. Something must be emitted by the light that comes out of the thing and then hits. It has to be a thing. We have to apply some matter to it until we come to the point and realize that these forces and energy isn't necessarily matter. Okay. It is particularly difficult for one who does not differentiate between that which is cognized by the intellect and that which is imagined, right? It's somebody and who tends mostly towards imaginative apprehension alone. So it's particularly difficult for someone who doesn't understand the difference between when you understand a concept versus when you see something and describe it. Right? For such a one, everything that is imagined exists or can exist, right? If I can imagine a construct, right, then it's real. Whereas that which does not enter within the net of imagination is, in his opinion, non-existent. If I can't describe it in terms, if I can tell you how big it is, how small it is, how what color it is, etc., then it's incapable of existing. Accordingly, to individuals of this kind, and they form the majority of those engaged in speculation, the true reality of a notion never becomes known, nor did its difficulty ever become clear to them. The only way to really understand it is by understanding that there are beings that we cannot describe based on their matter, right? So this is how, if you really want to understand an angel, you need to understand that it's possible to have a creative being that does things, that carries with it a force, but isn't made up of matter. Because of the difficulty of this matter, the books of the prophets likewise contain dicta, just like we said in reference to God before. We had to describe God himself in such ways that had human-like characteristics, even though they're completely irrelevant to God. In a similar sense, they contain dicta whose external sense can be understood as signifying that the angels are corporeal, that they move, that they are in the form of men, that they are given orders by God, and that they carry out his orders and do what he wishes in virtue of his orders. They had to describe it in such a way that there's a God. Imagine, and I'm deliberately saying this way, imagine him as an old man on a chair saying, you do this. And then there's a man standing in front of them who's one of the servants who says, okay. And then he goes down on the world and does this. That's an extremely anthropomorphic description of the entire process. God in an anthropomorphic manner, talking to a creature, be it a man or in the form of some other form, that goes out and does something, right? But we describe it that way. All this is said so as to guide the mind to a knowledge of their existence and of their being alive and perfect. It's because it wants to get us to the point, yes, there are angels. And think about it, there are forces that come from God, which influence forces that work in this world, which influence the things that happen in here. And that's where we're supposed to get to. And I deliberately chose the word forces, although it might be somewhat controversial. The Rambam would have used the term intellects that cause these intellects, these other things that cause things to happen in this world. As we have it's a similar way that we explain in regard to God himself, when we said that the Torah had to use anthropomorphic terms. However, if one would stop at this imagining with regard to the angels, if you just get rid of those images, stop thinking about the woman with white wings, right? Stop thinking about the flaming swords flipping round and round, or whatever your favorite angel image might be, then their true reality and essence would be like the essence of God. It would be similar to trying to understand the essence of God as it is conceived in the imagination of the multitude. For about God too, statements are made from whose external sense it appears that he's a living, mobile body having the form of a man. Therefore, the mind is guided towards the knowledge of the fact that the rank of the existence of the angel is below the rank of the deity. So therefore, as we guide people to the true knowledge, we want to say that in order to describe angels, remember, God had been described in Ezekiel's vision, excuse me for a second, as having the form of man, right? Which was, we had discussed before. And the angels are discussed in often taking the shape of irrational animals in order to emphasize in this scheme as being lower, right? As being the next step down. So that is what is understood with regard to the existence of the creator should be more perfect than what is with regard to their existence, meaning the angels. Just as man, which is the next step down, is more perfect than the irrational animals, which is down below him. However, an animal shape is attributed to them by attribution. When we do attribute animals, why do we choose wings as the image with an angel? Because flying cannot, when we want to represent the idea of flying, we represent it with wings, just like walking is represented with legs. The existence of these faculties cannot possibly be represented, right? Because I'm going to kind of read through. I just turned to page 110, the first paragraph. The idea is that wings represents something that we believe to be a perfect form of motion. Flying is swift, it's fast, you see it, you don't see it. It's something that we imagine to be great. So if we want to imagine something with an animal form that's higher than a human being, we describe it as having flight. However, we don't even ascribe flying to God. I'm on the second paragraph on page 110. Even the place where it says God rode upon a cherub, which is again, that's a reference to a verse in Psalms and Tehillim. So it doesn't mean that God was flying. It means that the cherub was flying, right? So it never refers to God himself flying. And he brings some examples where you might think it does, but he gets out of those examples. So those examples are in order, because even that we won't ascribe to God, because God is even above the angels. So we describe angels as flying because we want to bring them above human beings. We don't describe God as flying because he's above angels. And don't be led into error by what, the third paragraph, especially in Ezekiel with regard to the face of an ox and the face of a lion, the face of an eagle. These are also angels. We have another interpretation why it chooses those animals. We'll get to that later on when I go into more detail about the angels themselves. So, again, you can read the last paragraph, but he kind of reiterates everything that I just said, and I want to kind of call this subject to a close. So just to reiterate real fast, right? Again, the Torah describes angels in a similar way to the way it described God, by using anthropomorphic terms to describe something that has no matter, because human beings have difficulty understanding things that have no matter. Angels are created beings that we describe them as being created, as if they had form, as if they were being told by God to do things on this world, while in actuality, all that occurs is something emanates from God, emanates through the angels into the world in which we live. And that's this is congruous with Aristotle's understanding that God is the prime mover through whom the other forces of nature move, and then eventually nature moves. So that would conclude chapter 49. And I think that would be a good place to stop tonight. I'm going to open the floor for questions, comments, anything that anyone wants to say. Go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes, go ahead, please.
I've often thought, and I think it's correct, angels have no free will, right? By definition, they don't have free will, certainly not like humans. What is our position, Maimonides' position, Jewish tradition, on God? Does he have free will? Is that even a question that is ever asked? Is that so confined to humans? Because free will suggests we have choices. Angels have no choice. They're created with a single mission. They have no independent, if you will, intellect. They don't have free will. But since we were just discussing the similarity of angels and God, and the fact they have no body, is there a position on free will?
Free will and God. So it's a good question. Rambam would say that the entire concept of will is a human concept. It doesn't apply to God. So just like the famous question where it's asked, does God know the future? And if he knows the future, how could we have free will? If we say we have free will, then I could decide to do something else. But God already knew that I was going to do the other thing. So, and so on. So Rambam says God's knowledge is not like our knowledge. It sounds at first like a cop-out answer, but it's not, because it's actually a very deep answer. The idea of free will is a human idea, right? It's talking about us having the ability to choose. God's will, if it even is, you can't even use the term will. There's no such thing as will. Will is a reference to our desire. To describe God as having a desire at all would be minimizing his greatness.
Well, how do we explain, when Moses argues with God on Sodom and Gomorrah, presenting arguments, and
Abraham, but yeah,
I mean Abraham. So Abraham, and so Abraham's arguing with God, and it puts God not only with the body, if you will, or so similar, but it gives him the capability of making a choice and being, if you will, reasoned with. I mean, how does that fit into the scheme of things?
I mean, well, that the fact that gives human beings the opportunity to change the course of history, whether that the way we change things through our prayer, we change things through our realization, we change things through the way we act and what we do. And that's how prayer works by us changing ourselves.
That story portrays that not Abraham himself, but Abraham changes God's decision.
That's what it sounds like. Yes. But I mean, Rambam just told us in the last chapter, the first chapter we studied tonight, right? You know, that when God hears a prayer, right, it means that he agreed with it, right? Does it mean that I changed anything? Rambam also emphasized on numerous occasions that we don't change anything in God.
But
right?
doesn't the biblical story, I mean, doesn't the biblical story at least set forth that he made a decision, it made a decision to destroy Sodom, and then was persuaded by Abraham's great lawyerly
But
skill.
actually, he wasn't persuaded. He said, I could be, but he wasn't in the end, right? He decided.
Well, he didn't change it, but he said, if you give me this set of facts.
Yeah, so well, he was in that particular story, he was looking to see what kind of a leader Abraham was, but ultimately, no, we can't. And Rama emphasized that a lot. Our prayer doesn't change anything in him. How is that possible? What does it mean then that he listens to our prayer? So we can't when we say God's will or God's desire, it doesn't have anything, it's no relevance to what you and I call will or desire. I desire that piece of pizza, but God doesn't desire things. He doesn't want things. We can't even comprehend what it means that God wants things, right? But that in and of itself is so important for us to recognize. I mean, when you and I want something, it stimulates the endorphins in our brain. We all love the taste of pizza, it stimulates satisfaction in our bellies. We have desire because our hormones get a little wild. We have all kinds, but God it's a totally different understanding.
I guess what I'm driving at here is we all understand beautiful presentation on why God doesn't have a body, and the limitations of language require this anthropomorphism.
Right.
But the Bible seems to go beyond making a God a human figure with sight and all. It seems to put him in the role of a judge who listens to both sides and can be persuaded by humans. That there's an interchange between humans and God.
I mean, to the extent that's true, it's because when we change ourselves, we change the reality on the ground. When you stand in front of God and repent, you just made yourself into a different person.
Okay.
And this different person is dealt with by God and the universe that he created in a different way, right? Right. The person that stood here, that was here yesterday before you repented, and the person that's standing here today is not the same. And the way God will deal with you will be different. It's not so much changing anything in God, it's continuing the way the world works and the way God interacts with it. These are really fascinating questions and issues. Are there any other comments on either one of the subjects from tonight before we close up? Comments about angels? Anybody try to come up with a new image of an angel tonight? After now we can't think of them having wings anymore, so I'm gonna have to come up with a new one. I don't know. Disney, we'll have to call up Disney and tell them that they're not being my Maimonidean here. All right, everyone have a wonderful evening. Thank you for paying attention, and looking forward to next week. All right, bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right.